There is a kind of philosopher who builds, and a kind who burns. Lev Shestov burned, and he burned one thing only for 40 years, in book after book. His target was not religion, not morality, not any particular doctrine about the world. His target was the authority of reason itself, the quiet voice that says some things simply cannot be otherwise. Most people have never heard his name, yet Albert Camus treated him as a central figure of existential thought. D.H. Lawrence introduced him to English readers, and Edmund Husserl, the most rigorous philosopher in Europe, called this sworn enemy his most valuable friend. Shestov asked a question that sounds absurd until it suddenly does not. When reason tells you that what has happened cannot be made not to have happened, why do you obey? Who signed the decree, and why do you treat it as final? This is the complete arc of his thought, from literary criticism in Kiev to the last pages of Athens and Jerusalem. It ends with the strongest case against him, presented at full strength, because he would have demanded nothing less. Part 1. The Wall. Start with the picture almost everyone holds without knowing they hold it. There are truths that do not depend on anyone, truths that were valid before humans existed and will be valid after. 2 times 2 is 4. Whatever has happened, and no power in heaven or earth can reach back and unmake it. These truths feel like the most innocent things in the world. They are not commands, they do not threaten, they simply describe. On this picture, reason is a lamp. It shows you the structure of reality so that you can move through it without stumbling. To accept what reason shows is not submission, it is maturity. The person who rebels against necessity is like a child pounding on a locked door, and growing up means learning to stop pounding. Dostoevsky's underground man looked at this picture and saw something else entirely. In Notes from Underground, he describes the laws of nature as a stone wall. Sensible people, he says, stop in front of the wall, because the wall is final. The wall is 2 times 2 is 4. And then, he says, the thing that Shestov spent his whole life unpacking. What do I care for the laws of nature when for some reason I dislike those laws? Of course, I cannot break through the wall with my forehead. But I will not be reconciled to it simply because it is a stone wall, and I lack the strength. Notice what is being claimed here, because it is easy to misread. The underground man is not denying that the wall exists, and neither will Shestov. The claim is about a hidden step that everyone takes without noticing they have taken it. There is a difference between recognizing that something is the case and accepting that it ought to be the case. Reason establishes the first, but somewhere, silently, the first gets converted into the second, and the description becomes a verdict. Compulsion gets rebranded as truth, and submission gets rebranded as wisdom. Shestov's entire philosophy begins in the refusal to let that conversion pass unexamined. Make the abstraction concrete, because Shestov always did. A man's child has died, suddenly, stupidly, in an accident that 15 seconds would have prevented. Everyone around him says versions of the same sentence. What has happened, and you must accept it because the past cannot be changed. Notice that this sentence is not offered as cruelty. It is offered as the deepest available comfort, and it is backed by the full authority of logic. The proposition that the past is unchangeable seems as certain as anything humans know. Now ask the question Shestov asks. When did this man agree that logical certainty settles the matter? The truth about the past presents itself as neutral description, but for him it functions as a sentence handed down without trial. It demands not just acknowledgement, but reconciliation, the conversion of his grief into acceptance. Shestov wants to know why self-evidence carries that authority, and what exactly would happen if a person refused it. Here is where his originality begins to separate from ordinary irrationalism. The standard rebel against reason says that reason is weak, that it cannot grasp life, that intuition or feeling sees further. Shestov's claim is stranger and more precise. Reason is not weak, but tyrannical, and its tyranny is invisible, precisely because it never feels like force. A political tyrant needs police, prisons, and fear, and so his power is always visible as power. The eternal truths need nothing, because we enforce them on ourselves instantly from inside. Try, right now, to seriously entertain the thought that the past might be undone. You cannot do it. Something in you closes the question before it opens, and that closing feels like clarity rather than coercion. Shestov calls this the power of self-evidence, and he regards it as the most absolute power ever exercised over the human mind. He came to this through an experience he never described. Around 1895, in his late 20s, Shestov underwent some kind of collapse, a crisis he kept silent about for his entire life. Scholars have guessed at its nature, but the guesses matter less than the structure it left behind. Something happened to him that the available wisdom could not absorb, and he noticed that the wisdom blamed him for not being absorbable. He called Shakespeare his first teacher of philosophy, and one line of Hamlet became his private formula. The time is out of joint. For Shestov, this was not poetry, but the most accurate report ever filed. There are experiences after which the world's joints do not close again, and every philosophy he would ever attack was, in his eyes, a machine for pretending otherwise. So the problem is now on the table, and it is worth stating it as an explicit argument, because Shestov's books circle it endlessly without ever formalizing it. Premise 1. Reason presents certain truths as necessary, eternal, and binding on all minds. Premise 2. The bindingness of these truths is not itself something reason has ever proven, it is something reason presupposes. Premise 3. For the person whom these truths condemn, the grieving father, the dying man, the betrayed, their bindingness is not neutral, but is experienced as a sentence. Conclusion: the authority of reason is not a finding, but a surrender, and a surrender that was never examined can in principle be revoked. Every step of his later thought, the war on Spinoza, the alliance with Job, the leap toward the God for whom all things are possible, is an attempt to perform that revocation. But an argument like this does not come from nowhere. Before Shestov attacked necessity, he had to watch something else fail first, something that promised to console the crushed without challenging the wall at all. That something was morality, the religion of the good, and its two greatest modern voices were Tolstoy and Nietzsche. His first real book put them on trial together, and the verdict made him notorious in Russia. Part 2. Tolstoy, Nietzsche, and the Collapse of the Good. In 1900, Shestov published a book with a deliberately scandalous structure. It was called The Good in the Teaching of Tolstoy and Nietzsche, and it treated the saint and the Antichrist as the same case. To see why that pairing was an argument and not a provocation, you need the problem both men faced. It is the problem that appears the moment the wall from Part 1 has done its work. Suppose you accept that necessity cannot be fought. The earthquake will not be argued with. The disease will not be persuaded. The past will not be reopened. European culture had a standing answer to this situation, and it is a genuinely noble answer. So state it charitably. What nature takes from you, morality returns in another currency. You cannot control what happens to you, but you can control what you do, and your dignity lives entirely in that second territory. Be good, serve others, align yourself with the moral law, and no catastrophe can touch the part of you that matters. This is the Stoic consolation, refined by Kant into a system, preached by Tolstoy as a gospel. The good becomes a fortress built just behind the wall, the one place necessity cannot enter. Shestov read Tolstoy and became convinced the fortress was built backwards. Its walls did not face the catastrophe, they faced the victims. His evidence was Tolstoy's own writing, read against its stated intentions. Take the scene Shestov returns to, Tolstoy's encounter with the destitute of Moscow, recorded in What Then Must We Do? Tolstoy descends into the slums, sees misery that cannot be helped at scale, and is shattered by it. And then, Shestov observes, watch what the great moralist actually does with that shattering. He converts it into doctrine, into a teaching about how one ought to live, simplicity, labour, non-violence, service. The teaching aims itself at conduct, at what can be regulated, and quietly turns away from the people whose ruin no conduct will repair. Preaching the good, Shestov concluded, was Tolstoy's method of looking away while appearing to look directly. The good did not answer the horror. It changed the subject. The accusation sharpens into a formula that became Shestov's first famous sentence. Tolstoy, he wrote, used the good as a substitute for God, and the substitution fails at exactly one point, the point where a person needs help rather than instruction. Morality can tell you what to do. It has nothing to say to you when there is nothing to be done. And the cases where there is nothing to be done are not marginal cases. They are death, irreversible loss, incurable illness, the whole territory the wall encloses. An ethics that goes silent precisely there is not a fortress, Shestov argued. It is an anaesthetic for spectators. The healthy console themselves with the good about the ruined. Now Nietzsche enters, and the pairing starts to make sense. Shestov read Nietzsche not as a theorist, but as a man to whom the thing itself had happened. Here is the version of Nietzsche that mattered to him, stripped to the relevant structure. A brilliant young professor is destroyed by illness at the height of his powers, blinded by migraines, wrecked by vomiting fits, driven out of his profession into boarding houses. He had been a moralist of the Schopenhauerian type, devoted to compassion as the foundation of ethics. And in his ruin, he made a discovery that Shestov took to be the most important philosophical event of the 19th century. Compassion, the good, the entire moral order he had served, had absolutely nothing for him. Worse than nothing. The morality of compassion looked at his ruined life and could only classify him as an object of pity, a case, a patient. It offered him a role in other people's virtue. It could not even formulate the idea of his salvation. Nietzsche's revolt against morality on Shestov's reading was therefore not the invention of a predator's ethics. It was the cry of a man who discovered that the good is indifferent, that it functions perfectly well as a system while every individual it cannot help is quietly written off. When Nietzsche declared himself beyond good and evil, Shestov heard a man breaking out of a hospital that had no medicine, only rules. And this is where Shestov makes his own move, the move that separates him from Nietzsche and sets the program for everything after. He thought Nietzsche's diagnosis was perfect and his prescription was a relapse. Nietzsche tore down the authority of the good and then, in Shestov's eyes, immediately built a replacement authority, the will to power, the Superman, amor fati, the love of fate. Look closely at amor fati and you see the problem. Loving fate means embracing necessity, kissing the wall, turning submission into ecstasy. Nietzsche escaped morality only to surrender to the older and harder master behind it. So the book closes with the sentence that announced Shestov's entire future, and it deserves to be quoted exactly. Nietzsche has shown us the way. We must seek that which is higher than compassion, higher than the good. We must seek God. Be careful with that sentence, because in 1900 it was not yet a religious statement. Shestov had no theology to offer, and he would refuse to build one for the rest of his life. The sentence is a placeholder with a precise logical shape. Whatever can answer the ruined individual must stand above the good, because the good has been shown to abandon him, and above necessity, because necessity is what ruined him. The word God here names a job description, not a doctrine. Nothing yet fills it. What the Tolstoy and Nietzsche book established was a test, and the test is Shestov's real instrument. Do not ask of any philosophy whether it is coherent. Ask what it has to say to the person lying under the wall. Most philosophy, measured this way, turns out to be written by the unhurt, for the unhurt. But there were two writers, Shestov believed, whose thought actually began at the point of ruin, rather than theorizing about it from a distance. One he had already touched. The other was Dostoevsky, and in him Shestov found something stronger than a test, a whole counter-philosophy, born underground. Part 3. Dostoevsky's Underground and the Philosophy of Tragedy. 3 years later, in 1903, Shestov published Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, The Philosophy of Tragedy. The title contains a distinction that organizes everything inside, so build it first. Shestov divides all thought into two kinds, and the division has nothing to do with schools or doctrines. There is the philosophy of everydayness, and there is the philosophy of tragedy. The philosophy of everydayness is not shallow, and Shestov never calls it stupid. It is all thought-oriented toward the normal case, toward life as it runs when it runs. It asks how society should be arranged, how knowledge is possible, how conduct should be regulated, and it answers with structures, laws, norms, ideals. Its single defining feature is an assumption so deep it is never stated. The assumption is that the exceptions do not count, that the cases where life has broken are deviations to be managed, not data to be thought from. Idealism in all its forms, Shestov argues, runs on this assumption. It builds the palace of the universal and houses humanity there, and if a particular human cannot live in the palace, the failure is filed under his name, not the palace's. The philosophy of tragedy begins on the other side of a specific event. Something happens to a person that expels him from the normal case permanently, and then, this is the crucial condition, he refuses the two exits on offer. He will not be consoled because the consolations are false, and he will not kill himself because that only ratifies the verdict. He remains alive and unreconciled, and begins to think from exactly the position that all respectable philosophy declares unthinkable. Whatever such a person produces, Shestov calls the philosophy of tragedy. It is not a doctrine, but a position, the position of the man for whom the universal has died and who is now alone with reality. Dostoevsky is his prime exhibit, and the argument runs through biography because in this one case, biography is the argument. In 1849, Dostoevsky was a fashionable young novelist of progressive convictions, a believer in humanity, enlightenment, and the coming reign of justice. He was arrested for reading a banned letter aloud, sentenced to death, marched to the scaffold, and reprieved by design at the last moment. Then 4 years of Siberian penal servitude, in chains, among murderers. The Standard story says Siberia taught Dostoevsky compassion and faith in the Russian people. Shestov says the Standard story is a screen, and what actually happened was what he calls the regeneration of convictions. Dostoevsky discovered in himself, under pressure, that his humanitarian ideals were borrowed clothing, and that the real being underneath had never been consulted. The ideals had been for humanity. They had nothing whatsoever for him, the particular convict in the particular chains. The document of that discovery on Shestov's reading is Notes from Underground, and his interpretive claim was radical for its time. The underground man is not a character Dostoevsky diagnoses from a safe distance. He is Dostoevsky's own voice with the mask off, the unacceptable truth that the novels then spend decades managing. Read the famous taunts with this in mind, and they change character. The underground man says that consciousness is a disease, that suffering may be preferred to well-being, that a man might wish the world to collapse so long as he gets his tea. Polite reading treats these as symptoms. Shestov treats them as discoveries, each one reporting the same finding from a different angle. The finding is that the individual is not a unit of the universal, and when the universal claims him, something in him is entitled to say no, even against logic, even against his own interest, even against the whole of arithmetic. Here the scenario does real work, so take the most scandalous line and slow it down. The underground man declares that twice 2 is 4 is no longer life, but the beginning of death. On first reading, this is petulance. Now recall the grieving father from part 1. Hearing that what has happened has happened. For him, twice 2 is 4 is not a neutral piece of mathematics. It is the formal structure of the sentence passed on his child, the guarantee that the loss is locked. The underground man's hatred of arithmetic is the father's grief, generalized into epistemology. What looks like irrationalism is a claim about jurisdiction. Necessity rules everything, and yet a living person with full knowledge of the facts withholds consent. That withheld consent, useless, unjustifiable, indestructible, is the founding act of the philosophy of tragedy. Shestov then places Nietzsche beside Dostoevsky and runs the comparison with precision. Both were expelled from everydayness, one by the scaffold and Siberia, one by disease. Both discovered that idealism abandons its casualties, and both said so with a violence that polite culture still struggles to absorb. But Shestov tracks where each man flinched, because he believed both flinched. Dostoevsky, in the later novels and the journalism, increasingly covered the underground with orthodoxy, nationalism, and the cult of the Russian soul. Comfort Shestov regarded as borrowed and unconvincing. Nietzsche covered it with the eternal return and amor fati, the embrace of the very necessity that had broken him. In both cases, the pattern is identical, and Shestov names it without mercy. The philosopher of tragedy, unable to bear his own discovery, builds himself a new everydayness on the far side of the abyss. What he praises in them is therefore not their answers, but their refusal to let the question heal. And the book ends with a thought that scandalized its first readers and still has teeth. Hopelessness, Shestov says, is not the end of philosophy, but its true beginning, the most solemn moment in a human life. As long as hope remains, a person negotiates, adjusts, accepts substitutes, listens to reason's offers. Only when every door is verifiably shut does he stop negotiating, and only then does he see his situation without decoration. Everydayness calls that state paralysis. Shestov calls it the first honest vantage point a person has ever occupied. But notice the gap this leaves, because Shestov noticed it too. To say that real thinking begins in hopelessness is to issue a promise that something can actually begin there, that the ground zero is not simply zero. Dostoevsky and Nietzsche both fled the spot before building anything on it. Was there anyone who stayed, anyone whose entire art lived inside hopelessness, without consolation and without suicide, and made something there? Shestov found exactly one, and it was not a philosopher. It was Chekhov. Part 4. Creation from the Void. In 1905, Shestov wrote an essay on Anton Chekhov and gave it a title that states a paradox: Creation from the Void. Chekhov had just died, and Russia was canonizing him as a gentle humanist, a tender doctor with a sad smile. Shestov opened his essay with a sentence designed to end that canonization, and it remains the most famous thing anyone has said about Chekhov. Chekhov, he wrote, was the poet of hopelessness. Stubbornly, sadly, monotonously, over decades of work, Chekhov did one single thing. He killed human hopes. To feel the claim, look at where Shestov points, because he argues from the texts. Take the story A Dreary Story, which Shestov considered the turning point of Chekhov's entire career. Its hero, Nikolai Stepanovich, is an old professor of medicine, famous across Europe, decorated, beloved, a man whose life has been, by every public measure, a complete success. He is dying, and he knows it. And in the months of his dying, he makes an inventory and discovers that he possesses nothing. Not because his achievements were fake, they were real. But science, reputation, family, the entire structure turns out to have no load-bearing centre, no answer to the one question now being asked. His ward Katya, whose life has collapsed, comes to him and begs, literally begs, for one word of guidance. He is the wisest man she knows, and he has spent 60 years thinking. He answers that he does not know. The most educated man in Russia, at the end of a perfect life, has nothing to say. Everydayness has a whole repertoire for absorbing such a man, and Shestov's point is that Chekhov's art systematically disables every item in it. The professor cannot be told his life had meaning through his work. The story shows him seeing through that. He cannot be given religion, it is not there for him. He cannot even be condemned, he has done nothing wrong. Chekhov simply holds him before us, beyond help, and refuses to soften the picture by 1 degree. And he does this, Shestov insists, not once, but as a method, in Ivanov, in Ward 6, in The Seagull, across the whole mature work. Chekhov's true subject is the human being, from whom everything has been taken, and his discipline, unique in literature, is that he never reaches for the consolations he has shown to be empty. Now the title's paradox becomes the essay's argument. Common sense says nothing comes from nothing, and that a person stripped of every resource is finished. This principle is ancient. It is the bedrock of Greek metaphysics. Nothing arises out of nothing. Chekhov's heroes are the test case, because they are precisely people reduced to nothing, and Shestov watches what they do. They do not recover. Chekhov is too honest for recovery plots, but they also do not simply vanish. Something in them keeps working. A stubborn, objectless persistence that no longer rests on any ground, any hope, any reason. Shestov calls this creation out of the void, and he means the phrase with full metaphysical weight. Here, in these ruined people, something appears that has no cause in the visible order, no foundation, no justification. It exists groundlessly. Pause on why this matters for the larger argument, because this essay is a hinge in Shestov's development. Until now, his work has been diagnostic, a demonstration that morality and idealism abandon the ruined. The Chekhov essay contains his first positive datum. The principle that nothing comes from nothing is not an observation, it is an axiom, one of the eternal truths from Part 1, Part of the Wall. And Chekhov's people, simply by persisting and reaching where reason certifies there is nothing to reach for, constitute a quiet counterexample. Not a proof. Shestov never claims proof. A crack. The Wall says creation from nothing is impossible, and at the absolute bottom of human existence something happens that looks exactly like it. Shestov also draws a conclusion about method here, and it explains the strangest feature of his own books. Chekhov could show what he showed only because he wrote stories rather than treatises. A treatise must generalize, and generalization is the native operation of everydayness, the conversion of persons into cases. The reality Shestov is after, the single ruined individual and the groundless thing that stirs in him, dies the moment it is generalized. So a thinking adequate to it would have to give up the system form altogether, give up foundations, deductions, conclusions that bind. It would have to be deliberately fragmentary, deliberately inconsistent, loyal to the cases rather than the rules. Within months, Shestov published exactly such a book, and it made him infamous. Part 5. The Apotheosis of Groundlessness. The book appeared in 1905 under a title that is already a provocation, The Apotheosis of Groundlessness. Apotheosis means elevation to divine status. Groundlessness, in the philosophical vocabulary of the time, was the worst available insult, the name for thought that has failed. A grounded claim rests on foundations. An ungrounded one floats, unsupported, irresponsible. Shestov's title announces that he will take the supreme defect and crown it. The English edition, published in 1920 with an admiring foreword by D.H. Lawrence, carried the alternative title under which the book is still read, All Things Are Possible. The form of the book is the first argument. It is 168 numbered fragments, aphorisms, with no order, no progression, no thesis. One fragment contradicts another, and Shestov leaves both standing. Russian critics were appalled, and their reaction is worth taking seriously because it expresses the charitable common-sense view. A philosophy, they said, owes its readers consistency because consistency is honesty in thought. The thinker who contradicts himself is trying to win every hand, asserting whatever suits the moment. Fragments without system are not a method, they are an evasion of the basic duty to be checkable. That is a reasonable standard, and nearly everyone holds it. Shestov's answer goes to the root of what consistency actually demands. To be consistent is to let your past assertions govern your present ones, to treat yesterday's conclusion as binding on today. But why is yesterday binding? A person changes, sees from a new position, undergoes what Dostoevsky underwent in Siberia, and the demand for consistency orders him to keep faith with a self that no longer exists. Consistency, Shestov argues, is the wall from Part 1 installed inside your own mind, the past declared unalterable and given authority over the living present. The systematic thinker is a man serving a life sentence handed down by his own earlier opinions. The aphorism is simply thought that has refused the sentence, thought that reserves the right to begin again at every moment. He once remarked that people are shocked when he asserts two contradictory propositions at once, and his shrug at the shock is the book's whole stance. Inside the fragments, one demolition matters more than the rest, the demolition of the word truth as philosophy uses it. Run the argument explicitly. Premise 1. What we honour with the name truth is, in practice, whatever can be demonstrated, that is, whatever every rational mind can be forced to accept. Premise 2. Forcing every mind to accept something requires keeping only what is identical across all minds and all situations. The universal. Premise 3. Everything that makes an existence this existence, its onceness, its unrepeatable position, its private catastrophe, is precisely what is not identical across cases. Conclusion: the criterion of truth is structurally blind to individual existence, not by accident, but by design. Demonstrability is a filter, and what it filters out is exactly what tragedy needs to talk about. When a philosopher says only the universal can be known, he is not reporting a discovery, Shestov says. He is describing the settings of his own instrument and calling them the world. This is why groundlessness gets the apotheosis, and the point is easy to misread, so make it precise. Shestov is not claiming that floating free of evidence makes beliefs true, and he is not licensing fantasy. The claim is about what grounds are, seen from below. A ground is what your conclusions rest on, and what rests on something is governed by it. Every foundation is therefore also a ceiling, every support is a constraint, and a fully grounded thought is a fully chained one. For the inhabitants of everydayness, the chains are comfortable and even invisible. For the man under the wall, the grounds are precisely what hold the wall up. Groundlessness is not his theory. It is his only exit, the sole condition under which the words "all things are possible" could ever be more than a phrase. That phrase, the book's second title, deserves a moment, because it is aimed at a specific target. The deepest axiom of Greek thought, deeper than any particular doctrine, is that not all things are possible, that being has a structure, that necessity sets limits no power can cross. Even the gods of Greek philosophy obey it, Aristotle's God most of all. Against this stands a sentence from an entirely different world, the gospel sentence that with God all things are possible. In 1905, Shestov deploys the phrase with no theology attached, as pure defiance, a banner over the rubble. But a banner is not a position, and he knew it. Because the honest reader of this book is left with a hard question, and the Russian critics, for all their outrage, were circling it correctly. Demolition is intelligible, but what is the positive content? If all grounds are chains, what does the liberated person actually do on day 2? Groundlessness as pure negation collapses into a skepticism that cannot even assert itself, and Shestov was too sharp to miss the trap. What he needed was a different account of where the chains came from, not just that reason binds, but why and how its authority was ever installed. He found the account in the oldest story he knew, a story about a garden, a tree, and a serpent who promised knowledge. Reading that story as a precise philosophical document is the work of his maturity, and it is where his thought turns religious. Part 6. The Serpent's Promise. Around 1910, Shestov did something unexpected for a notorious skeptic. He immersed himself in scripture, in Luther, in the medieval theologians, reading them not as a believer, but as an investigator. He was hunting for the answer to the question his own demolition had exposed. Reason rules the mind with absolute authority, yet that authority was never argued for, never proven, never even openly claimed. Power of that kind is not a fact of nature. It has a history, and a history means an origin, an event at which the power was installed. Shestov became convinced that one ancient text records that event with the precision of a forensic report. It is the 3rd chapter of Genesis, the story of the fall. State the familiar reading first, because Shestov's reading only makes sense against it. God places the first humans in a garden and forbids one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The serpent persuades them, they eat, and God punishes them with toil, suffering, and death. On this reading, the story is about obedience. The knowledge itself is desirable, and the crime is merely that it was taken without permission. Centuries of theology softened the picture further, treating the forbidden fruit as a symbol of pride or lust, anything but what the text actually names, because what the text names is awkward. The fatal tree is the tree of knowledge, and the catastrophe that follows is the direct consequence of knowing. Shestov takes the text literally at exactly the point everyone else goes figurative. The fruit was knowledge, and knowledge was the catastrophe, not the occasion for it. Read the Serpent's words as he reads them, as the founding document of philosophy. Your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Every term in that promise deserves pressure. Opened eyes means self-evidence, the experience of seeing that something is so and cannot be otherwise. Knowing good and evil means possessing autonomous criteria, standards that judge by themselves, without reference to any will, even God's. And you shall be as gods is the payoff. Sovereignty through criteria, the power to evaluate everything from a standpoint that bows to nothing. Now ask what was actually delivered, because Shestov's whole argument lives in the gap between promise and delivery. The first humans bit into knowledge expecting godhood, and what entered them instead was necessity. The moment you know, in the strict sense, you are bound, because knowledge is precisely the registration of what cannot be otherwise. Before the fruit, on Shestov's reading, reality was answerable to no structure, all things were possible, and existence hung freely from a living will. After the fruit, possibility contracted. The world acquired iron joints, the eternal truths took their thrones, and death, the supreme impossibility of return, entered with them. The serpent did not lie about the eyes opening. He lied about what they would see. They opened onto the wall. Be precise about the philosophical claim being made, stripped of the narrative. Premise 1. The authority of self-evident truth is not itself self-evident. It functions as an unexamined surrender. Premise 2. Every surrender is an event, something that happened, whether in history, in childhood, or in the structure of the species. Premise 3. What was installed by an event has the status of an event, contingent, datable in principle, revocable in principle. Conclusion. Necessity is not the eternal face of being, but the residue of a catastrophe, and the feeling that it cannot be questioned is the catastrophe still operating. Genesis matters to Shestov not as revealed doctrine, but as the only text in the Western canon that classifies knowledge itself as the disaster. Everyone else, from the first philosopher onward, classified it as the cure. And here the Greek evidence falls into place with a click. The oldest surviving sentence of Greek philosophy is a fragment of Anaximander, written within a few generations of the earliest biblical redactions. It says that individual things, by coming into existence, commit an injustice, and must pay the penalty for it by perishing according to the ordinance of time. Sit with what that sentence assumes. Simply to exist as an individual, to be this and not everything, is treated as guilt, and death is the just sentence for the crime of being born. Shestov puts the fragment beside Genesis and points out the terrible symmetry. Both texts record the same event, but from opposite sides. Genesis reports the verdict as a catastrophe that befell us. Anaximander reports it as justice from the side of the court. Greek philosophy on this view is the serpent's promise institutionalized, the catastrophe converted into a curriculum. Test the framework against the figure Shestov uses as the test, Socrates. Socrates was the best man in Greece, and Athens poisoned him, a fact that should have detonated Greek confidence in the order of things. Watch instead what Socrates does with his own death sentence, because Shestov watched it with something like horror. Socrates argues calmly and brilliantly that the good man cannot be harmed, that virtue is knowledge, that the philosopher spends his life learning to die. He converts his own judicial murder into an illustration of eternal principles, and goes to it serenely, the first and greatest victory of understanding over outrage. All of Europe took this as the summit of human dignity. Shestov takes it as the fall happening a second time, in broad daylight, with witnesses. A living man agreed to weigh his own destruction on reason's scales, found the result acceptable, and drank. So the mature position is now assembled, and it reorganizes everything from the earlier books. The wall of Part 1 is not the structure of reality. It is the legacy of an event, and the underground man's refusal is not pathology, but anamnesis, a dim memory of the freedom before. But an origin story raises an obvious demand. If knowledge is fallen, show us the fall operating in its most perfect modern instance, in a thinker so honest that nothing in him can be blamed except the knowledge itself. Shestov agreed, and he knew exactly who the instance was. For 30 years, across every book, he returned to one adversary the way a tongue returns to a broken tooth. Part 7. Spinoza, the Great Adversary. Every serious thinker has one opponent who is not like the others, and for Shestov, that opponent was Spinoza. The choice needs explaining, because it looks wrong on paper. Spinoza was a persecuted Jew, expelled by his community, who lived poor, refused honours, ground lenses, and died at 44 without bitterness. By every human measure, he is the most admirable figure in modern philosophy, and Shestov says so repeatedly and without irony. He calls him the noblest, the purest, the most honest of philosophers. That is precisely why he chose him. Against a corrupt opponent, you only ever defeat the corruption. Shestov wanted to fight knowledge itself, and so he needed the one man in whom knowledge appears with no admixture of vanity, careerism, or fear. Begin with Spinoza's project, stated as charitably as it deserves. Spinoza looked at human misery and located its source not in the world, but in our way of receiving the world. We suffer because we take things personally, because we treat events as aimed at us, as outrages, as betrayals by a universe that owed us something. But the universe is not a person, and owes nothing. It is one infinite substance, unfolding according to its own necessity, and everything that happens follows from its nature as rigorously as theorems follow from axioms. Spinoza's ethics is even written in the format of geometry, definitions, axioms, propositions, proofs. Understand this fully, he promises, and grief loses its grip, because grief is just an inadequate idea, a confusion about what was ever possible. The free man thinks of nothing less than death, and his wisdom is a meditation on life. The whole program condenses into one instruction, and Shestov quoted it so often it became the emblem of everything he opposed. Not to laugh, not to weep, not to curse, but to understand. Hold that sentence up and turn it slowly. It presents itself as neutrality, the scientist's clean hands, judgment suspended so that truth can appear. Shestov reads it as the most extreme demand ever made on human nature. Laughter, tears and cursing are not noise interfering with perception. They are perception, the immediate registering of events as mattering, as good or as monstrous. A man weeping over his child's body is not failing to grasp the situation. He is grasping it. Spinoza's instruction asks him to trade that grasp for another one, in which the death is a necessary consequence of the nature of things, no more to be wept over than an eclipse. Now run Shestov's argument against the trade, with the premises explicit. Premise 1. Spinoza's consolation works by identifying the sufferer's viewpoint as error and the viewpoint of the whole as truth. Premise 2. The viewpoint of the whole is reached by subtraction. You arrive at it by deleting your location, your attachments, your onceness, everything that makes the loss a loss. Premise 3. A consolation that works by deleting the mourner has not answered grief. It has dissolved the griever. Conclusion. What Spinoza offers is not peace, but anesthesia, administered at the level of identity, the cure of the disease by the death of the patient. The technical name for the maneuver is viewing things under the aspect of eternity. Shestov's gloss is colder. Under the aspect of eternity, no one in particular exists, and that is the entire secret of why nothing there can hurt. The theological dimension makes the case sharper still. Spinoza uses the word God constantly. The ethics is soaked in it. God or nature. The intellectual love of God. Shestov insists on reading the fine print of that famous phrase. God or nature means God is nature, and nature means the system of necessity, which means the word God now names the very thing it once stood against. The God of Abraham was a will, someone who could be argued with, who could repent, who could make the impossible happen. Spinoza's God cannot do anything other than what follows, cannot respond, cannot hear, has no more freedom than a triangle has to change its angles. Shestov's verdict is deliberately shocking. Spinoza did not defend God against the atheists. He completed the work the Serpent began, sealing necessity inside the holiest word in the language. Modern philosophy, which built on him, inherited a God already embalmed. One contrast lights up exactly what Shestov wanted instead, and it comes from an unexpected ally. Descartes, in his letters, defended a doctrine almost no one followed, that even the eternal truths were created by God. 2 and 2 make 4 because God willed it, and had God willed otherwise it would be. Professional philosophy treated this as Descartes' embarrassing excess. Shestov treats it as the one moment modern thought glimpsed freedom, the truths dethroned, made creatures deprived of their independent jurisdiction. Leibniz supplies the counter-image, writing that the eternal truths enter the mind of God without asking permission. There is the whole war in one picture. Either the truths ask permission, or God does. Spinoza chose, with total honesty, the second, and Shestov spent his life prosecuting the choice. But honesty cuts both ways, and Shestov's prosecution forced a question about jurisdiction itself. Who decided that understanding has the right to judge weeping, that the geometric method holds the gates through which a human being must pass? Reason does not merely describe, Shestov concluded. It claims the power to admit and to exclude, to declare what may count as salvation at all. There is an old ecclesiastical name for exactly that power, the power of the keys. His next major book put the name on the cover and aimed the accusation at philosophy itself. Part 8. Potestas, Clavium, and the Keys to Heaven. In 1923, newly exiled from Russia after the Revolution, Shestov published Potestas Clavium, the power of the keys. The phrase has a precise origin. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus tells Peter that he will give him the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and that what Peter binds on earth will be bound in heaven. On that sentence, the Catholic Church built its most audacious claim, that an earthly institution holds the keys, that admission to salvation passes through its judgments. Protestant Europe spent rivers of blood rejecting the claim as a supreme usurpation. Shestov's book opens by accepting the Protestant outrage completely, and then turning it on a target the Protestants never suspected. His thesis is that the Church was a junior partner in the usurpation, and a late one. The keys were first seized centuries before Peter in Athens, when philosophy established the principle that truth is one, universal and compulsory for every mind. Look at what that principle actually asserts, because familiarity hides its scale. It asserts that there exists a single tribunal, impersonal and permanent, before which every conviction, every hope, every experience must appear and receive its verdict. Whatever the tribunal certifies, all must accept. Whatever it rejects is error, and holding error is the one universally recognized form of perdition left in the modern world. Reason, in other words, binds and looses. It admits beliefs into legitimacy and casts them out, and its judgments are enforced in every classroom, every laboratory, every serious conversation on earth. That, says Shestov, is Potestas Clavium, and no pope ever wielded it so completely. The historical argument of the book traces how the usurpation captured religion itself, and the story has a name in scholarship: Hellenization. Christianity began as an unphilosophical scandal, a message about resurrection, about the last being first, about faith moving mountains. Within a few generations, its educated converts grew ashamed of the scandal and began translating it into the only respectable language available, Greek metaphysics. God became the unmoved mover, the absolute, the guarantor of the moral order, a concept Aristotle could have audited without surprise. Shestov watches the translation with a kind of grim fascination, because at every step the translators believed they were defending the faith. They were, in his account, surrendering it, clause by clause, to the tribunal. A God who must satisfy reason's criteria has already handed over the keys, and whatever he now unlocks, he unlocks with permission. Take the concrete case the book keeps circling, because it shows the stakes inside a single human transaction. A medieval theologian, fully Hellenized, considers the prayer of a mother whose son has died. She is asking God to give him back. The theologian explains, with compassion and learning, why the prayer cannot be granted as asked. The past is immutable. even for God, because the contrary involves contradiction, and omnipotence does not extend to contradictions. What can be granted is acceptance, consolation, the inner reordering of her will toward what is. Notice what stands behind the explanation. Necessity has been installed inside God as his own deepest nature, and the keys to what may be hoped for hang from reason's belt. The mother's actual request was never refused by God, Shestov observes. It was ruled inadmissible before reaching him, dismissed at the door by the doorkeeper. Against this he sets the figures the tribunal could never process, and the book's energy lives in these portraits. Tertullian, the African church father, who wrote that the Son of God died, and it is believable precisely because it is absurd. Polite scholarship has always rushed to soften the sentence into rhetoric. Shestov takes it straight as a declaration of independence from the criteria, faith defined as the capacity to affirm exactly where demonstration fails. Or the elderly Jewish scholar of legend, who, told that the truths of geometry hold even for God, answered that his God was above geometry. These are not arguments, and Shestov knows they are not arguments. They are refusals of jurisdiction, the defendant standing up and denying that the court is a court. Be exact about what Shestov is and is not claiming, because this is where casual readers lose him. He is not claiming that contradictions are true, or that logic fails within experience, or that bridges can be built by faith. Within the fallen world, he says plainly, knowledge works, and only a charlatan denies it. His claim is jurisdictional from start to finish. The tribunal's writ runs over the repeatable, the public, the demonstrable, and it has quietly extended that writ over the unrepeatable, the private, the once only, the dead child, the destroyed life, the human being as such. The extension is the usurpation. Nothing in logic licenses logic's sovereignty over hope, and the feeling that resistance is futile is not an insight, it is the doorkeeper's stare. The book left one flank exposed, and Shestov was too honest not to notice. His entire case assumed that the tribunal's authority rests on self-evidence, on truths that simply announce themselves as binding. But while he was writing, the most formidable philosopher in Europe was rebuilding that authority from the ground up, with a rigour no theologian ever approached. If self-evidence could be secured the way Edmund Husserl claimed to secure it, Shestov's revolt was finished before it began. The two men collided, first in print, then face to face, and the collision became the strangest friendship in 20th century philosophy. Part 9. The Quarrel with Husserl. In 1911, Edmund Husserl published a manifesto called Philosophy as Rigorous Science, and it is the perfect inverted mirror of everything Shestov wanted. Husserl's fear was relativism. Psychologists of his era were explaining logic as a fact about human minds, the way our particular brains happen to associate ideas. Husserl saw the consequence with total clarity. If logic is just human habit, then truth is a local custom, and the proposition 2 and 2 make 4 reports our wiring rather than reality. Science collapses into anthropology, and anthropology, being a science, collapses with it. Against this he mounted the most celebrated counterattack in modern philosophy. Truths are not psychological events, he argued. They are ideal, timeless, valid, independently of any mind that thinks them. and they are given to us in moments of pure self-evidence that no future experience could overturn. Shestov read the manifesto in Russia and recognized his enemy's general staff. In 1917, in the middle of war and revolution, he published an attack on Husserl with a title that announces its angle: Memento Mori, Remember Death. The essay concedes almost everything, and the concessions are the strategy. Husserl is right that the psychologists were sloppy, right that relativism devours itself, right that knowledge, if it is to be knowledge, requires exactly the ideal, compulsory truths he describes. Shestov's objection enters one level higher, at a point Husserl never thinks to defend. Husserl has proven rigorously what knowledge requires. He has nowhere proven that the requirements of knowledge are entitled to govern a human life, and the title names the witness he never calls. Bring a dying man into the seminar room, Shestov says in effect, and ask what the ideality of truth has for him. The truths are eternal, and he is not, and the entire rigour of the system consists in its licence to ignore that asymmetry. Put the disagreement in its sharpest form, because it is genuinely deep, deeper than either man's admirers usually allow. Husserl argues if self-evidence can deceive, then no claim is secure, knowledge is impossible, and thought drowns. Therefore, self-evidence must be final. Shestov accepts the conditional completely and reverses the conclusion. If the finality of self-evidence is what condemns the dying man, the grieving mother, the underground, then perhaps knowledge as defined deserves to drown, or at least to be confined to its province. One man treats the possibility of science as the fixed point and adjusts everything else around it. The other treats the cry of the single human being as the fixed point and is prepared to sacrifice the architecture. There is no neutral ground from which to referee, because the choice of fixed point is precisely what is in dispute. Shestov saw this with perfect clarity, and it is why he never once called Husserl wrong in the ordinary sense. He called him the most consistent man alive, and consistency, remember, was for Shestov a charge. Then comes the turn no novelist would risk. In 1928, the two men met at a philosophical gathering in Amsterdam, the ageing founder of phenomenology and his most violent critic. They became close, immediately and permanently, visiting, corresponding, walking and arguing until Husserl's death a decade later. Husserl told colleagues that no one had ever attacked him so sharply, and that this was exactly why they were friends. Shestov, in the memorial essay he wrote when Husserl died in 1938, returned the tribute in his own key. Here was the one man, he said, for whom the question of truth burned with the same fire as for himself, who staked everything on it, and who therefore understood what the war was about. The mediocre rationalist and the mediocre mystic could chat pleasantly, having risked nothing. These two could not pass each other without combat, and the combat was the respect. The friendship produced one consequence that reshaped Shestov's last decade, and it arrives like a punchline written by Providence. It was Husserl, the arch-rationalist, who pressed Shestov to read a writer he had somehow neglected, telling him he would find there his own thoughts, carried further than he had carried them. The writer was Kierkegaard. Shestov, past 60, read him, and was shaken in a way nothing had shaken him since Dostoevsky. Here was a man who had fought self-evidence a century earlier, alone, inside Christianity, with weapons Shestov recognized as his own. The encounter gave his final books their decisive vocabulary, the absurd, the leap, the suspension of the ethical. But before the Kierkegaard harvest, Shestov gathered his own, and the gathering has a court of its own choosing. Husserl's tribunal weighed claims on the scales of evidence, and Shestov had spent 20 years arguing those scales were rigged against the human being. Rigged scales invite a counterscale, and Shestov found his in the oldest protest literature in existence. A man sits on an ash heap, scraping his sores, and demands that his calamity be weighed properly, weighed whole. The book Shestov built around him is his masterpiece of the middle period, and its title is The Demand Itself. Part 10. Job's Scales. In 1929, Shestov published In Job's Balances, and the title is a citation with an argument folded inside it. In the 6th chapter of the Book of Job, the ruined man answers the friends who have come to console him. He wishes, he says, that his grief were thoroughly weighed and his calamity laid in the balances together, for then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Read the wish slowly, because everything is in it. Job is not asking for an explanation, and he is not yet asking for restitution. He is making a claim about measurement. There exist scales, the world scales on which his catastrophe has already been weighed and found tolerable, instructive, compatible with the order of things. And he is asserting that those scales are false, that weighed truly, his grief outweighs the sand of the sea, outweighs, that is, the world. The friends of Job are the permanent characters of the book, and Shestov reads them as the embodiment of everything from Athens. They are not villains, and the text is careful about this. They sit with Job in silence for 7 days before speaking, which is more than most comforters manage. But when they speak as the tribunal. The world is governed by order. Order is just, therefore suffering on this scale must have a proportionate cause, and wisdom consists in accepting the equation. Each friend is a philosophy of everydayness wearing robes. And the scandal of the book, the reason Shestov builds on it, is the ending. God himself, speaking from the whirlwind, declares that the friends have not spoken rightly, and that Job, the accuser, the screamer, the one who refused every consolation, has. The essays inside the book apply Job's scales to Shestov's permanent witnesses, and the opening image of the Dostoevsky essay became his most famous page. There is a Jewish legend, he writes, that the angel of death is covered all over with eyes. Sometimes the angel comes for a person too early, and finding it is not yet time, departs. But before leaving, he leaves the person 2 eyes from his own body. And from then on, that person sees what others do not see, sees, as it were, with double sight, the world everyone shares and something else through it, something the first eyes were never built to register. Such a person becomes useless for ordinary purposes, Shestov says, and begins to report things that cannot be confirmed, cannot be taught, cannot even be properly said. Dostoevsky, marched to the scaffold and reprieved, was visited exactly so. The second sight is Shestov's name for what the philosophy of tragedy sees, and the legend explains why its reports will never pass the tribunal. Evidence is by definition what the common eyes can check. The Tolstoy essay runs the same instrument over the great novellas of death, above all the death of Ivan Ilyich, and the reading is surgical. Ivan Ilyich has lived a life the scales of the world approve completely: career, propriety, the right furniture, the right opinions. Then he is dying in pointless pain, and the approved life simply evaporates, revealed as never having been his. The household continues its decorum around him, and the decorum is the horror, because it is the world's scales still weighing, still finding everything in order. One peasant servant, Gerasim, sits with him without pretense, and that single honest presence is the only thing in the house not lying. Tolstoy, the preacher, Shestov argues, never matched what Tolstoy, the artist, knew. The artist knew that the universal life is a fraud exposed by death, and he wrote the exposure with a power no philosopher has approached. The most surprising essay turns the scales on a Greek, and the choice shows Shestov's range. Plotinus, the last great pagan philosopher, built the most refined, rational mysticism of antiquity, a vast architecture of emanation and return. Yet in the late treatises, Shestov finds a man straining against his own architecture. Plotinus writes that the soul's goal lies beyond intellect, that to reach the one, the soul must, in his own astonishing phrase, soar above knowledge. The summit of Greek reason, in its last great representative, declares that the highest thing is reached by leaving reason behind. Shestov treats the passage as a confession smuggled out of the enemy capital. Even in Athens, even at the top, the second sight stirred, and the most disciplined knower of his age admitted that what mattered most was on the other side of knowing. Out of these readings, the book distills the concept that governs Shestov's final period, and it needs careful statement because it is routinely mangled. He calls faith the second dimension of thought. The first dimension is the one the tribunal patrols, where thinking moves from evidence to conclusion horizontally under compulsion, and every step can be checked. The second dimension does not move horizontally at all, and it does not compete with the first on its own plane. It is the dimension of the struggle against self-evidence itself, where thinking confronts not this or that fact, but the finality of fact as such. Faith in Shestov's strict usage is not belief without evidence, which would just be bad first-dimension thinking. It is the audacity that continues to demand, like Job, after demonstration has closed the case, the refusal to let proven impossibility have the last word. Whether that audacity ever receives an answer, no book can certify. Shestov's claim is only that it is thinking, real thinking, and that a philosophy with one dimension has amputated the human being. He knew the concept needed ancestors, men who had actually lived in the second dimension rather than theorizing it, and who had paid the full price of residence. He had found two, long before the Kierkegaard discovery, and he had been writing about them since the war years. One was a French scientist of genius who sewed a secret document into his coat and wore it against his body for 8 years. The other was a German monk whose despair was so total that he concluded salvation could not depend on anything a human being does. Pascal and Luther are the subjects of the next part, and they bring the war to its darkest ground. Part 11. Pascal's Night and Luther's Despair. On the night of November 23rd, 1654, Blaise Pascal had an experience he never described to anyone. We know of it only because of what was found after his death. Sewn into the lining of his coat was a scrap of parchment in his handwriting, transferred from coat to coat for 8 years, worn against his body like a wound he refused to let heal. The text is broken, ecstatic, barely grammatical. It begins with one word, fire, and then a line that Shestov treated as the most important sentence written in the modern era. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and the scholars. Take the measure of who is writing this. Pascal was not a poet overwhelmed by feeling. He was one of the founders of probability theory, a physicist, an inventor, a mathematician of the first rank. He knew exactly what the philosopher's God was, because his contemporary Descartes had just rebuilt it, a God certified by proofs, guaranteeing the reliability of clear and distinct ideas. The memorial, as the parchment is called, records the moment Pascal discovered that this certified God and the God who answers are not the same being, and that the certification is the obstacle. Not of the philosophers means the proofs do not reach him. The God of Abraham is found when he is found on the far side of the criteria, and what Pascal felt that night was not a conclusion. It was fire. Shestov's essay on Pascal, written in 1923, is titled Gethsemane Night, and the title carries his entire reading. In the Garden of Gethsemane, the Gospels say, Jesus sweated blood in terror while his disciples slept. Pascal wrote a sentence about that scene which Shestov never stopped quoting. Jesus will be in agony until the end of the world, and we must not sleep during that time. Now set this against the official philosophy of Pascal's century and of every century. Philosophy's promise, from the Stoics to Descartes to Spinoza, is precisely sleep, tranquility, ataraxia, the untroubled mind achieved through understanding. Pascal reverses the value of the entire tradition in one move. If the agony is real and ongoing, then tranquility is not wisdom, it is desertion, and the disciples sleeping in the garden are the first philosophers. Shestov reads Pascal's deliberately cultivated anguish, his refusal of distraction, his famous horror at the eternal silence of infinite spaces, not as morbidity, but as discipline. Staying awake is the method. Pascal supplies Shestov with the French front of his war. Luther supplies the German front, and the terrain there is darker. Around 1913, Shestov wrote an entire book on Luther and medieval theology, Sola Fide, By Faith Alone, which the war stranded in manuscript and which appeared only after his death. Its question is the one Luther's own question forces. Luther was a monk of catastrophic conscientiousness, fasting, confessing for hours, auditing his own soul with a rigour that frightened his confessors. The system told him that salvation follows from works, that grace cooperates with effort, that the account books balance. And the harder he worked, the more clearly he saw the books would never balance, because the auditor inside him was incorruptible. Judged by the law, by any law, by the criteria as such, he was condemned, and so was everyone, and the honest conclusion of the whole machinery of merit was despair. Luther's discovery, the doctrine that detonated Europe, was that the despair was the message. Salvation by faith alone means, read through Shestov, that nothing a human being does, achieves, merits or proves has any purchase on what matters most. The criteria do not need adjusting. they need dethroning, because their jurisdiction was the disease. Shestov fastens on the most scandalous pages of Luther, the ones polite Protestantism prefers to forget. Luther wrote that under the law he had not loved but hated the righteous God, hated him with blasphemy in his heart, and that this hatred was the truth of his situation. He wrote in The Bondage of the Will that human freedom before God is nothing, that we are ridden like beasts by whichever rider mounts. Respectable theology treats these as excesses. Shestov treats them as data, the second dimension speaking in its native accent, which is not serenity but blasphemy, accusation, and collapse. Now state what Pascal and Luther jointly establish in Shestov's architecture, because they are not decoration. They are his proof of concept inside Christianity itself. Both men possess the criteria at the highest level, one as a scientist of genius, one as a virtuoso of the moral law. Both worked the criteria honestly to the end, and both found that the end was condemnation, the wall, Gethsemane, the unbalanceable books. And both then made the same structural move. Not refinement of the criteria, not consolation within them, but an appeal past them, to a God who is not the conclusion of anything. The fire in the coat lining and the faith born of despair are the same event in two languages. Shestov's term for that event, taken from the man he was about to discover, is the leap. Because there was a third figure in this lineage, the one Husserl insisted he read, and the encounter dominated his final decade. A century earlier, in Copenhagen, a young man had broken his own engagement to the woman he loved, convinced that something in him made marriage impossible. He spent the rest of a short life producing under masks the deepest analysis of faith and impossibility ever written. Shestov read him as a brother arriving late, and also, characteristically, put him on trial. Part 12. Kierkegaard and the Night of Faith. Shestov's last completed book, Kierkegaard and the Existential Philosophy, grew from lectures given in Paris in the mid-1930s. Its subtitle announces the frame, a voice crying in the wilderness. The book's thesis can be stated in one line, and the line is strange enough to need the whole part. Kierkegaard, Shestov argues, fled from Hegel to Job, from the greatest system in history to a man on an ash heap, and that flight is the founding act of existential philosophy. The biographical core is the broken engagement, and here Shestov's rule about minimal biography bends, because for Kierkegaard the biography is the laboratory. In 1841, Kierkegaard ended his engagement to Regine Olsen, the woman he loved completely and continued to love until he died. He never gave the reason, gesturing only at a thorn in the flesh, some incapacity or secret that made the marriage, in his eyes, impossible. The word impossible is the hinge. Kierkegaard did not lose Regine to rivalry or accident. He lost her to a verdict, something in the order of things that said this cannot be, and he accepted the verdict while refusing to accept it. Out of that double state, obedience with an unhealed wound, came the books, written at desperate speed, many under invented names. Shestov reads every one of them as a single continued negotiation with the impossibility, conducted in public in disguise. The decisive document is Fear and Trembling, and its subject is Abraham on Mount Moriah. Reconstruct the problem as Kierkegaard builds it, because it is built like a trap. God commands Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, the son of the promise, the meaning of his whole life. Ethics, the universal, has a clear verdict on a father killing his son, and the verdict does not contain exceptions for private revelations. So either Abraham is the father of faith, as three religions insist, or he is a murderer, and there is no third reading. Kierkegaard's terrible suggestion is that both descriptions are accurate from their respective standpoints, and that faith, if it exists, is what he calls a teleological suspension of the ethical, a moment when the single individual stands higher than the universal. The phrase deserves its scandal. Everything Europe means by civilization is the priority of the universal over the individual, and Abraham, the founding patriarch, breaks it. Inside this book, Kierkegaard draws the distinction that Shestov adopts as his final vocabulary. There are two nights. The night of infinite resignation gives up the beloved, the finite thing, completely, and converts the loss into inwardness, into an eternal love that needs no possession. He is recognizable, noble and tragic, and philosophy has honored his type forever, because resignation is a movement reason can map. The Knight of Faith makes the same renunciation and then adds a movement that cannot be mapped. He believes that he will receive the beloved back, here, in this life, in the finite, and he believes it on the strength of the absurd, because with God all things are possible. Abraham raises the knife in full resignation and full expectation simultaneously. Kierkegaard circles this figure with open envy and open bafflement, repeating that he can understand the movement of resignation but cannot perform the second movement, cannot even understand it. Here, Shestov's reading turns prosecutorial, and the trial of Kierkegaard is the most intimate thing he ever wrote. The evidence is Kierkegaard's own development after fear and trembling. The categories deepen, the Christianity grows harsher, and suffering moves to the centre until the late works teach that to be loved by God is to be ground down, that the truest Christian is the most tormented. Edification through suffering, suffering as the mark of election. Shestov names what he sees with the diagnosis prepared 30 years earlier for Nietzsche. This is amor fati in Christian dress, the wound converted into a pulpit, necessity embraced and renamed grace. Kierkegaard described the night of faith and lived as the night of resignation, and the gap between the two nights, Shestov argues, runs through his every page as its secret subject. He fled Hegel to Job's ash heap, and then, unable to bear Job's demand, began to preach the ash. Yet the verdict is not condemnation, and the difference matters for understanding what Shestov thought any of this was for. Kierkegaard failed the second movement by his own confession. But he did something no philosopher before him had done. He located it, defined its logic, and refused to let its impossibility be classified as meaninglessness. One sentence of his became Shestov's banner in the final books. The opposite of sin is not virtue, the opposite of sin is faith. Read it against everything since Socrates and its violence appears. The entire ethical tradition holds that what redeems is virtue, conduct, the universal honoured. This sentence says redemption belongs to a different axis entirely, the axis of possibility, and that a virtuous despair is still despair, still sin, still the wall obeyed. By the middle 1930s, Shestov possessed everything: the diagnosis, the genealogy, the witnesses, the vocabulary. He was approaching 70, and he gathered the whole war into one final book, the one he had been writing his entire life under other titles. Its name sets two cities against each other, and its question is whether they were ever compatible at all. Part 13. Athens and Jerusalem. Athens and Jerusalem appeared in 1938, months before Shestov's death, and its title states a thesis by withholding a conjunction. Not Athens and Jerusalem reconciled, not Athens versus Jerusalem decided, just the two names, side by side, with the tension live. Athens means the conviction that truth is necessary, universal and compulsory, and that wisdom is submission to it. Jerusalem means the conviction that the ultimate reality is a living will, that all things are possible, and that wisdom is the audacity to demand the impossible. The entire history of Western thought, Shestov argues, is the history of attempts to merge them, and every merger, without exception, was a surrender of Jerusalem dressed as a synthesis. The book's first part is called Parmenides in Chains, and the image governs everything. Parmenides, the most radical of the early Greeks, taught that only being is, that change and motion are illusions, because reason demonstrates they involve contradiction. Notice the structure of the event, because Shestov makes it the primal scene of philosophy. A living man who walks, ages, and will die is compelled by demonstration to declare his own walking unreal. He sees the conclusion is monstrous, and he submits because the steps are valid and validity is sovereign. Parmenides is in chains, and the chains are his own proofs. Shestov's point is not that the proofs contain an error someone might find. His point is the spectacle itself, demonstrated truth functioning as a power that compels a man against everything he is, and the man calling his compulsion insight. Even the gods of Greek thought wear the same chains, since necessity, all the schools agreed, is what even gods cannot touch. The second part bears the book's most ferocious title, In the Bull of Phalaris. Phalaris was a Sicilian tyrant who roasted his victims alive inside a hollow bronze bull, engineered so the screams emerged as music. Ancient philosophy, wanting to prove virtue sufficient for happiness, generated a famous boast, repeated by Epicureans and Stoics alike. The sage, they said, would be happy even inside the bull of Phalaris. Generations of philosophers transmitted this sentence as the summit of ethical heroism. Shestov holds it up as the self-exposure of the whole tradition. To call the man in the bull happy, you must redefine the man until the screaming part of him does not count, until only the rational ruling faculty is really him, and that faculty, being aligned with necessity, is beyond harm. The boast is Spinoza's anesthesia again, but stripped of its gentleness, audible now as what it is. Ethics grown from knowledge, Shestov concludes, ends by harmonizing the screams, and a philosophy that can pronounce that man happy has lost the right to be believed about anything. The third part turns to the medieval centuries, the one era that held both cities in its hands, and reads their reconciliation as the tragedy inside the triumph. The schoolmen received the God of Abraham and the logic of Aristotle, and they made a decision so natural it was never experienced as one. Revelation, they ruled, must be intelligible, defensible, compatible with the eternal truths, since truth cannot contradict truth. Shestov tracks the consequences through the centuries with a kind of mourning. Each generation of believing genius, precisely by defending the faith brilliantly, moved the keys further into reason's keeping, until the God being defended had become a first cause, a guarantor, a conclusion. The fall of Genesis on his reading repeated itself inside theology, and the serpent's promise was fulfilled in scholastic Latin. You shall know, and your knowledge shall judge even God. Against all of this, the book sets its positive teaching concentrated in the final part on the second dimension of thought, and it must be stated with Shestov's own care, because he refuses to the end to make it a doctrine. Philosophy, he writes, should be not reassurance, but awakening, a fight against the self-evidences, with no guarantee attached. He does not claim to demonstrate that the past can be undone, that the poisoned Socrates can be unpoisoned, that the dead return. Demonstration is Athens, and a demonstrated Jerusalem would be Athens with incense. What he claims is strictly negative and strictly enormous. The impossibility of these things has never been shown either, only installed, and the installation was the fall, and a human being retains the right to fight it in the dark without credentials. The book's closing line gives the program its final form. Philosophy is not contemplation, but struggle, and the struggle has no end, for the kingdom of God, as it is written, is taken by violence. He died that November in Paris, with Europe weeks past Munich and the catastrophe assembling. The argument, however, did not die, because a younger generation had been listening, and one of its members was about to make Shestov a permanent character in the century's debate. He did it by attacking him in the most famous essay on the absurd ever written. Part 14. Camus, Fondane, and the argument over despair. In 1942, in occupied France, Albert Camus published The Myth of Sisyphus, and near its centre stands A Reckoning with Shestov. Camus had read him closely, and the essay's famous starting point, the absurd, owes Shestov a debt Camus openly acknowledges. The absurd for Camus is a relation, the collision between the human demand for meaning and the silence of the world. He surveys the thinkers who describe the collision honestly, and ranks Shestov among the most penetrating, the man who never stopped pointing at the fissure in every rational edifice. Then comes the charge, and it is the strongest objection Shestov ever received, so build it at full strength. Camus calls it philosophical suicide. The reasoning runs in 3 steps. Step 1. The absurd exists only as a confrontation. It lives in the tension between my demand and the world's refusal, and it dies the instant either side is dissolved. Step 2. Shestov, having described the refusal more vividly than anyone, then converts it into a doorway, declaring that where reason ends, God begins, that the absurd is the threshold of the leap. Step 3. This move does not endure the absurd, it liquidates it, because the silence has been reinterpreted as a voice, the wall as a gate, the defeat as evidence of rescue. Shestov escapes, Camus says, and the escape is suicide of the lucidity that made him great. Against the leap, Camus sets his own figure Sisyphus, condemned to roll the stone forever, who scorns the gods, keeps the absurd alive by refusing both hope and surrender, and of whom Camus writes the century's most quoted closing line. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. The reply came not from Shestov, who was dead, but from the man he had called his truest pupil. Benjamin Fondane was a Romanian Jewish poet who arrived in Paris in 1923, met Shestov a year later and became his interlocutor, his record keeper, and his continuation. His Book of Conversations with Shestov remains the best portrait of the man, and his own philosophical work, above all The Unhappy Consciousness, carried the war into French. Fondane and Camus met and argued, and Fondane's counterattack on the Sisyphus position can be reconstructed from his writings with precision. Look closely, Fondane says in effect, at what Camus asks of Sisyphus, and ask whether you have seen it before. Sisyphus must renounce hope, accept that the stone will always roll back, and find his dignity, even his happiness, in lucid consent to the eternal repetition. Now name the components: renunciation of hope, acceptance of necessity, dignity through consent, happiness inside the punishment. This is the bull of Phalaris, with better prose. It is amor fati, the Stoic sage, the night of resignation, the entire Athenian consolation returning one more time, now wearing rebellion as a costume. Camus accuses Shestov of escaping the absurd upward into God. Fondane answers that Camus escapes it downward, into acceptance, and that calling the acceptance revolt does not change its chemistry. The truly unbearable thing, the thing neither Athens nor Camus permits, is what Job did. Not consent, not the leap as a comfortable certainty, but the scream that continues, the demand maintained against demonstrated hopelessness, hope refusing its own refutation. Notice that this exchange contains a real philosophical question, not a misunderstanding, and it is still open. Both sides agree the consolations of reason are bankrupt. Both refuse cheap transcendence, and they divide over a single point that may be the deepest fault line in existential thought. Is lucidity the final virtue, so that maintaining the truth of the silence outranks everything, as Camus holds? Or is lucidity itself the last and subtlest of the self-evidences, the wall's final disguise, so that fidelity to the screaming individual outranks fidelity to the verified facts, as Shestov and Fondane hold? No experiment decides this, because what counts as honesty is exactly what is in dispute. Each position can describe the other completely and convict it, which is the signature of a genuine antinomy rather than a soluble problem. History gave the argument an ending no one would dare invent. In March 1944, Fondane was denounced and arrested in Paris with his sister Line. Friends, Camus, reportedly among those who intervened, secured his release because his wife was not Jewish. The release did not cover his sister. Fondane refused it and stayed with her. They were deported to Auschwitz, where he was murdered in October 1944. The philosopher of the irrational, faced with the most rational of choices, chose against the arithmetic, 2 deaths instead of 1, for nothing demonstrable. Those who knew him understood that he had not contradicted his philosophy. He had signed it. The story of Shestov's reception could end there, on its highest note. But a philosophy is not finished until it has faced its full opposition, and the opposition to Shestov is serious, layered, and in places unanswered. He would have despised a presentation that softened it. So here is the case against him, at strength. Part 15. The case against Shestov. The first objection is the one every reader formulates within an hour, and it must be handled first because Shestov's answer to it is real. He argues, for 40 years, against reason's authority, he produces reasons, draws distinctions, cites evidence, constructs genealogies, and expects his arguments to persuade. Is the performance not self-refuting, the man sawing the branch he sits on? Shestov's reply is jurisdictional, consistent with everything else in him. He never claimed logic fails within its province, and arguments are how one fights inside the enemy's territory, the only territory where books exist. His target was never inference, but sovereignty, reason's right to rule the whole of life, and you may use the court's own procedures to contest the court's jurisdiction. The reply works, as far as it goes. But notice what it concedes. The decisive thing, the second dimension itself, can never appear in his books, only be gestured at, which means the books are all preface, 40 years of preface to a text that cannot be written. The second objection comes from his closest friend, and it cuts deeper. Nikolai Berdyaev, who loved him for 4 decades and debated him to the last weeks of his life, made 2 charges. First, monotony. Shestov had one theme, one enemy, one move, and he made every author in history either a witness for it or a defendant against it. The Nietzsche of the scholarly record, the Kierkegaard of the journals, the historical Luther, all are violently cropped to fit the single frame, and specialists in each figure can document the cropping. Second, and worse, emptiness at the destination. Shestov's faith, Berdyaev argued, has no content whatsoever, no community, no practice, no love of neighbour, no day after the leap. It is pure negation of necessity, a war that cannot define victory. Berdyaev's question is brutal in its simplicity. Suppose the wall fell tomorrow. What then? What would anyone do? And in what would the redeemed life consist? Shestov has no answer, and his admirers should admit that he has none on principle, which is not the same as having one. The third objection is moral, and it is the gravest. Shestov's war on the universal is conducted entirely from the standpoint of the sufferer confronting necessity. But the universal, the despised ethical, is not only a consolation machine, it is the protection of the weak against the strong. The command not to kill does not primarily comfort me, it shields my neighbour from me. A teleological suspension of the ethical looks sublime on Mount Moriah and looks rather different from Isaac's position under the knife. Once the single individual stands higher than the universal, what distinguishes the knight of faith from the fanatic, the visionary from the murderer, who also heard a voice? Kierkegaard at least agonized over this question for a whole book. Shestov, his critics charge, barely registers it because his gallery of sufferers contains no victims of other people's leaps. A philosophy built entirely around my catastrophe, with no structural place for the other person, has amputated something too, and the amputated organ is justice. The fourth objection is logical, and it targets the dearest hope of all, the undoing of the past. Shestov's God can make what was not to have been, can return Job's children, the actual ones, not replacements. Press on the coherence of this. If the past is undone, the grief never happened. The griever who prayed for the undoing never existed in his grieving, and the prayer erases its own occasion. Who exactly is satisfied by the answer when the person to be satisfied is constituted by the loss. Either the undoing is real, and there is no one left to receive it as an answer, or memory of the loss persists, and the loss was not undone, but overwritten. Shestov never confronts this knot directly. His defenders can say the objection deploys exactly the logic whose jurisdiction is in question, and the defence is formally available. But a position that must dismiss every objection as jurisdictional overreach has insulated itself from all possible criticism, and insulation from criticism is a property Shestov spent his life attacking in others. There is a fifth objection, quieter than the rest, and perhaps the one he would have felt most. His thought is a philosophy for the moment of shipwreck, and it is unmatched there. But human beings do not live in the moment of shipwreck, even the shipwrecked. They get up, feed children, rebuild, return to the everydayness Shestov could only describe as falsehood. A philosophy with nothing to say to Tuesday afternoon, to ordinary work and ordinary love, has classified most of every human life as sleep, and the classification may say more about the classifier than about the life. Czesław Miłosz, who admired him profoundly, observed that Shestov is read greedily by people in despair and set aside with gratitude when the despair passes. Whether that is a refutation or the precise confirmation of his doctrine of the two dimensions, each reader must decide. It is, at minimum, a limit. Lay the objections side by side and notice their common shape. Every one of them convicts Shestov by standards, logical, ethical, scholarly, practical, whose sovereignty is the very thing he contested. This does not dissolve the objections. They remain in force for anyone who accepts the standards, which is nearly everyone, nearly always. It does mean the case against him cannot be closed from a neutral bench, because there is no neutral bench, and that discovery is itself Shestovian. The final question is therefore not whether he was right, a question his own framework renders undecidable. The question is what remains usable, what still works on the living, 90 years after his death. The answer is more than his marginal reputation suggests. Part 16. What remains alive? Begin with the visible inheritance, because it is larger than his fame. Camus built the central chapter of the myth of Sisyphus against him, which means the 20th century's most read meditation on the absurd has Shestov load-bearing in its foundations. Georges Bataille entered philosophy partly under his guidance, working with him in Paris in the 1920s and helping translate him into French. And through Bataille a thread runs onward into the French thought of transgression and the limits of knowledge. D.H. Lawrence sponsored him in English. Gilles Deleuze reached for him decades later, borrowing from Shestov the figure of the private thinker, the one who thinks from the underground against the public image of thought. Czesław Miłosz wrote the finest single essay on him, calling its subject the purity of despair, and credited Shestov with sustaining his friend Joseph Brodsky and a whole lineage of Eastern European writers for whom official optimism was the enemy's dialect. Boris Groys placed him at the centre of what he named anti-philosophy, the tradition that does not answer philosophy's questions but disputes its tribunal, and in that frame Shestov stands beside Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein as a founder. The deeper inheritance is thematic, and the first theme is theodicy, or rather its refusal. After the Holocaust, a current in Jewish and Christian thought arrived at a position now called anti-theodicy, The conviction that every justification of God in the face of suffering, every explanation that makes the catastrophe acceptable within a larger order, is morally obscene. The friends of Job must simply be refused, not refined. Shestov is the great anticipator of this current, the man who had already identified justification itself as the enemy, decades before the event that made the point unanswerable. When contemporary philosophers of religion argue that the demand to make suffering intelligible is a demand the sufferer may rightly reject, they are on ground he surveyed alone. The second living theme is his analysis of scientism. And here precision matters because the point is routinely flattened. Shestov never attacked science, and he mocked those who did. His target was the silent conversion of method into metaphysics. The slide from this is what our instruments measure, to this is all there is. The demonstrable, he argued, is a filter, and what the filter removes, the unrepeatable, the first personal, the once only, is not thereby shown to be unreal. Every contemporary debate about whether consciousness, meaning or value are real or merely residue left by an incomplete science is a debate about the filter's authority. Shestov's contribution is not an answer, but a warning with teeth. Watch the moment when a criterion of evidence quietly becomes a criterion of existence, because that moment is never itself supported by evidence. The third theme is the one that explains why his readers feel found rather than instructed, and it concerns grief. The contemporary languages of loss, clinical, therapeutic, popular are languages of process, stages, integration, moving through, acceptance as destination. They are the friends of Job with better training, and they help many people, which Shestov would not deny. What he provides is a defense of the one thing those languages cannot frame except as failure, the mourner who refuses, who maintains that the loss is unacceptable, not as a stage, but as a position, indefinitely. Shestov is the only philosopher in the canon who says plainly that this refusal can be a form of fidelity and even a form of thought, the second dimension operating in an ordinary life. People in that position discover him the way the shipwreck discovered driftwood, and no critique in part 15 reaches them, because their need is not theoretical. So assemble the final picture and keep both of its sides. Judged as a system, Shestov fails, and fails on purpose, since systems were the accusation. He proves nothing, founds nothing, leaves no method, and his positive teaching fits in a phrase that cannot be cached: with God all things are possible. Judged as what he actually was, something rarer than a system builder, he succeeds almost completely. He is the permanent advocate of the single human being against every court that would weigh, justify, and file the catastrophe, a writer who guarded one door for 40 years so that it would still be there, unlocked, for whoever came needing it. Most readers will never need that door, and for them Athens is enough, as it was always enough for the healthy. But some night the joints of the world give way for someone, and the consolations arrive, and they are discovered to be made of cardboard, everyone. The person standing there is not, it turns out, the first. Someone went ahead, mapped the territory, passed the last argument, and left the report. The report does not say that the wall will fall. It says, and this is everything it says, that no one ever proved you must kneel to it. Keep screaming. That is philosophy too, the oldest kind, and it is yours by right.